Hi, Brad. Do you want to come back? Okay, so it's bang on the hour. I was going to give it another minute for people to come in, uh, and then I will introduce us and kick it off from there. Okay, well, I'll start. We had 70 people registered, so I'm assuming a few more will come in, but we'll just kick this off. So thank you very much for joining me for this webinar in September. We're going to focus on what I think is, for me, extremely urgent issue, which is increasing and thinking about corporate accountability for forced labor and supply chains. The premise for me is that there really isn't enough corporate accountability, and I've been really lucky to have three people join me who have really for me put their back into trying to make this happen and understand the challenges of this from certainly from the US perspective, but also the global perspective. As someone who came to the US on the issue of human trafficking and forced labor, this is the country where corporate accountability has been happening, if it's been happening anywhere. And so to have these guys join me and speak about this is, I feel really lucky, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about. I'd like to first introduce Jane Khodarkovsky. Jane is a partner at Arcturos, where she focuses on financial integrity and regulatory matters, litigation, and white-collar criminal defense. Prior to Arcturos, Jane was general counsel and head of risk and compliance of a blockchain company focused on global financial inclusion and sustainability. And she spent over a decade as a federal and state prosecutor, most recently as a trial attorney and human trafficking finance specialist in the money laundering and asset recovery section, MLARS, for those who know it and on that name, criminal division in the US Department of Justice. Secondly, I'm joined by Brad Brooks-Rubin, who is also a partner at Arcturos, and this is not an Arcturos event. It's just that I've known these guys for a while, and they ended up at the same firm, and made it easier to speak to them, but that was not planned. I'm very glad they're both here. Brad recently served as senior advisor at the Office of Sanctions Coordinator within the Department of State. Brad held key leadership roles at NGOs, most recently at the Century, where he developed innovative policy approaches for combating corruption in Africa. Before his current role, Brad served as strategic advisor and North America engagement lead at the Responsible Jewelry Council, and he also served as special advisor for conflict diamonds at the Office of Threat Finance Countermeasures at the US State Department, and as the attorney advisor at OFAC within the Treasury. Finally, Dave Rogers served as a federal criminal investigator for over 25 years. He spent the last 4 years of his career as the manager of FBI's global human trafficking program within the Civil Rights Unit, training government units on human trafficking enforcement from Central and South America, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. He started his law enforcement career as a special agent within the US Department of Labor, Office of General Inspector. Upon retirement from the FBI in 2015, Dave joined Hope for Justice to serve as the US Program Director, and in 2017 and to 2020, he served as Director of Law Enforcement Operations at the Human Trafficking Institute, which is where we met Dave, where he worked on established dedicated anti-human trafficking units within police forces in Uganda and Belize. He currently serves as a special advisor for Atlas Free. Thank you very much for joining me. Those bios and more extensive ones are on the website. I hate reading these things out, but it's so important that you know, if you're listening, who it is that is speaking. So what I'm going to do, as I've done previously, is just set up a few slides just to talk through the issue of corporate accountability in a few minutes, because it's important that for anyone who's watching this who isn't familiar with this issue, that we're all roughly on the same page. So what I've done is I've started just by looking at the, for those who are familiar with it, the US State Department's TIP report from last year, which covers, for the last, I guess, 8 years, has covered the number of prosecutions and convictions in relation to human trafficking. What we see is that this is the global figure, is that in 2023, the number was only 1,256 convictions, and the number of corporations, like multinational corporations, I think is probably zero. And there's a reason why I can say that with some degree of confidence, although, as you know, in any kind of rhetoric and logic, proving a negative is always quite difficult. But these numbers never really take off until you get to 2023. And although I don't have the underlying data, so it's difficult to understand why there was a sudden jump, we will wait for this report when it eventually, when it comes out, or hopefully it comes out, and then see if the data aligns up more with the previous numbers, or with that whether that year ends up being an outlier. But still, the numbers are low, and that is obviously concerning if we're saying that tens of millions of people are in situations of forced labor, but certainly many more, hundreds of millions, are at risk of it. So what are the reasons why we should think about criminal investigation and prosecution of corporations of forced labor? There are an increasing amount of civil awards occurring, and so there's that, often as a comparison, civil or criminal, and that's not really a way of framing it. And that's quite important to think that these are all, in the work of corporate accountability, these are all different types of resources that we can use. They're not substitutional, and there's an important reason why I should think that. And as someone who worked for a long time as a general counsel, I never thought of them as substitutional. They were a cascade of different types of accountability that I really did not want to have to deal with. Criminal was always at the top of that list, and for reasons which I'll put forward here. And these are quotes from various people. So the first one is that civil penalties will only deter to the same degree as criminal penalties if the civil penalties are at least as great, if not larger, than the criminal penalties. And in reality, that often isn't going to happen. And we'll hopefully explore some of the reasons why. That can be an argument in terms of actual financial awards, but overall, I think that for me, there's good reason to say that this is agreeable as a statement that I agree with, and I think there's a reason that is in good favor of criminal investigation prosecution. Reputational harm, which is something often people talk about, naming and shaming, which can come from other types of accountability, often isn't monetized, is that, yes, it can have a stock exchange effect. Suddenly it's out in the press and stock price goes down, but that is not very common, and it doesn't often translate into actual monetary loss. Something I experienced personally is that prison time for white-collar workers, they don't like it. It freaks them out, and they get very worried by it. Someone who watched that take place when raids happened and white-collar workers were taken away, their cultural change can be very, very quick. And that's to the point 4, is that criminal enforcement often has the ability to change corporate culture very, very fast, because it doesn't happen very often, but B, it is very invasive in a way that civil litigation, for example, is not, and that's quite important. The other thing I would say from a personal perspective is that when criminal enforcement and investigation happens, it tends to happen to the people who are involved in doing it at that time. Whereas something like civil litigation, it can take years and years and years, and the people who were involved in the issue at the time often have left the business, and the actual action has been inherited, or the suit has been inherited by people who simply were not around when it happened. A few other reasons are the stigma of a criminal conviction hangs over a corporation and the people who are involved in it for a long time. It is a difficult smell to remove, or a stain to expand. And something like forced labor, which has a very moral component, human dignity component, is much harder than, say, a complicated or technical fraud where maybe many people don't even understand what happened. Criminal investigations can identify corporate conduct that's hard to find by any other means. Because of the power that investigators and prosecutors have, they're able to understand, identify information that often is simply not available under sort of corporate civil disclosure discovery. And that's pretty important, is that element of interaction between criminal investigators and the corporation and its personnel. Criminal offenses can give rise to the offense of money laundering. In the case of human trafficking forced labor, it's a predicate offense. that's a big problem, because it starts to look at the money aspect of things, which is what this is all about. And if you are convicted, or even if you're arrested, to be honest, is that you start to appear on a lot of adverse lists where people say, should we give this person a bank account? Should we be providing them with benefits of other things, of course, that we don't want to? So there are some good reasons for pursuing criminal investigations. Burden of proof is another one. As someone who was in a corporate counsel position, the problem with a criminal conviction was that it was the highest burden of proof, and you knew if the company was found guilty or individuals were found guilty, then civil suits would cascade out of that. And often it was a question of something like whether you could simply defeat things through a time bar, knowing that civil suits were just waiting. So that's, from an accountability perspective, criminal investigation prosecution can be very powerful. So here's just a statistic that is number of Fortune 5 companies investigated for forced labor. And it's important to bear in mind what Fortune 500 companies represent in the global economy, in the US economy. The number that are investigated so far is 1. And I happen to know that because I was partly involved in it. The only way I could prove this is because 2023, I received this certificate somewhat out of the blue from the World Customs Organization as a certificate of merit for being involved in what was described as, and this was relating to Goodyear Tire and Rubber, the first of its kind to address forced labor in the global supply chain of a Fortune 500 company. So when I tell people, oh, it's only ever happened once, and they're like, well, how do you know that, and how do you prove it? When it was impossible to do so. But then the certificate came along with this note, and now I can at least say, oh, these guys thought it was the first one. And in actual fact, it's very hard to find another Fortune 500 company or multinational that has in some way been investigated and held accountable. Why is that important? Because Fortune 500 businesses, for example, make up 2/3 of the US GDP, a whopping $19.9 trillion. So that is a lot of business that is happening that has never been held accountable for things like forced labor since the last century and the one we're in now. So this is pretty important to think of it that way. These companies employ 31 million people worldwide, and that, I think, is employ as in full employment. We know that there are lots of contractors in these things. So it's important to think that's where that's what's at stake. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to the speakers that have joined me, and I want to put this to Jane first of all, because I think she had some interface with the Goodyear case. I'm going to allow her to say what she can say. But why is it only 1? Why have we seen so few cases in corporate accountability under criminal statutes? And is it a case that it just hasn't really got started and we need to develop more and help things develop more? Or is it something that has been happening for a long time and it just has never really stuck?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Duncan, for getting us all together. It was always a pleasure to work with you when I was at the Department of Justice. I will keep my remarks to what I can say, and not speak to anything that may have, happened while I was in the government. I think to start off, the foundation that we have to, as both practitioners and former law enforcement or folks that are still in the government, I think about is really destigmatizing the perception that because there is an investigation into forced labor or any type of human trafficking, that it cannot be done from a corporate responsibility or corporate investigation. We have the skills, we have individuals who, who investigate white collar crimes all the time and investigate corporate companies both domestically and abroad. And so the first thing, and Duncan, you know this from many of our conversations, is really the education piece for law enforcement and for prosecutors, that just because we're using the term forced labor, or it's an investigation into a crime that doesn't necessarily neatly fit into a box that we typically think about, whether it's foreign corrupt practices, right, where there's a specific unit within the Department of Justice in the US that looks at companies and those who work at the companies from sort of a criminal law lens. I think that's the first piece, is that education, the ability for resources within different parts of the government. I'm sure, Dave, you'll speak to this also from your experience, to really make sure that people understand that they have the tools that are available to them to conduct these investigations, even though the underlying, and as you said, Duncan, predicate offense may be the exploitation of someone, whether it's someone working at a farm that's operated by a large conglomerate, or it's cotton that is being picked for the clothes that are then sold in companies in the US. To your point around Goodyear, right? It really all started, and this is all public information, from a case that was brought by workers on the ground in Malaysia from a workers' compensation perspective. And so one of the, I think, goals is to understand what are the different levers that are available to law enforcement, and partnering with law enforcement across jurisdictions, because when we're talking about Fortune 500 companies or companies in general, many of them are not going to just be domiciled in one jurisdiction. So you may have victims potentially of forced labor who are all over the world, and that is a complexity for law enforcement in order to identify, to then interview, to meet that burden, Duncan, that you were talking about beyond a reasonable doubt for a criminal proceeding. But I also think that there is information that is available if you're a Fortune 500 company, if you're a publicly traded company, that allows investigators more access to information to do an investigation without, being very public about it. But a lot of that has to do with education and resources, and really devoting that subject matter expertise, and developing it in a way that it can be effective. And I think one other thing I'll say, I think that is really important, is when we talk about forced labor, we're talking about human trafficking more generally. The question is always, well, why do we care? Like, why do we need to do these investigations? And the statistics, which are not perfect, they're always imperfect, show that since COVID, since 2011 to now, I think it was in 2023, the new statistics show that criminal enterprises make over $236 billion of revenue from the exploitation of people, whether it's in sex trafficking or in forced labor. And I always say that's the number we know, but we also know that these are such underreported crimes that means that the revenue that's generated by these criminal networks is likely exponentially larger. And so when the question is, why should we care to do these investigations? The reality is, if you don't follow the money, if you don't hold not only the individuals perpetrating these crimes, but potentially the companies that are profiting from it, there's no way to really dismantle the criminal networks to deter people from doing this again, even if we are relying on civil remedies or business reputational risk. But I think people need to also understand sort of the magnitude of the revenue that's generated from this illicit activity, to also build in that interest, frankly, and the buy-in from those who have to approve these investigations, and really be comfortable with how long an investigation may be, or the resources that are necessary. But at the end of the day, there is real consequences for, one, hopefully depriving these companies and individuals profiting from this exploitation, but also then helping the victims recover through restitution or other methods some of these funds that ultimately were made by their own exploitation and work.
No, thank you, Jane, for introducing that. And Dave?
Yeah, I think the challenge is, and I love, Jane, that you said that there are a whole bunch of people that know how to do these cases, financial crimes investigations. I actually think that number is pretty low in law enforcement. And that's to me one of the challenges when we start talking about the human trafficking realm. Human trafficking is presented as a human rights problem, which it is, right? But the reality is also it's an economic crime. And frankly, that's how we're going to attack it. We have to be able to attack it through economic crimes. I taught at the FBI Academy. I taught financial crimes investigations at the FBI Academy, and you should have seen the number of panicked faces every time I would introduce, hey, we're going to start talking about economic crimes now, and we're going to start talking about doing financial investigations. And man, some of the brightest people in the, that we've dealt with, all of a sudden are freaking out about it. And I'm like, no, we're good. We know how to do this, and we can make it happen. And so, and that's at the federal level. At the state and local level, where actually we're going to come up with where we're going to be doing source development, where we're likely to get the tips about these problems. Most of those investigators have had none, if any, training in conducting financial investigations. And to marry on, Jane, with what you said too, I think the financial crimes investigators don't know anything about human trafficking, and they freak out. We're not reattaching retinas here. We can actually learn this. This is something that we can all figure out and we can do. And so I think more resources need to be like cross disciplines, right? We need people who have the financial crimes investigations expertise to partner with the street investigative level work that needs to be done to conduct these investigations. There are a lot of reasons why labor trafficking is not being looked at. I think some are legitimate, some are, to be, in my opinion, professional laziness. I've had prosecutors tell me don't even bother bringing me a labor trafficking case because it doesn't have any jury appeal, which frankly enraged me, So, and my response was, that just tells me how bad you are at your job, So, because if you can't take somebody's exploitation and sell it to a jury, there's a problem there. So, but I think the challenges are there in very remote areas. How do you conduct the investigations? Where are you getting your sources of information? How do you vet those sources of information? Oftentimes, labor trafficking language is a big issue. So translation capabilities, not interpretation, but actual translation, that becomes an issue as well. So I think there are a multitude of reasons why they're challenging, but those are just they're not just excuses, but they're reasons. Frankly, the human trafficking efforts in the United States, the resources that are attached to them are relatively small compared to other types of crimes. And Jane, your point that you brought about is like, how big is the problem? And Duncan, you talked about that too. Like, people want to know how big the problem is before we're going to attach resources to it. They never asked me about that, about the drug problem. They never asked me when we had the housing crisis in 2008. They just said, go get it. They didn't ask me how big the problem was. So I think there's this underlying disbelief that it's actually, because we were all raised, at least, in the Western world, we were raised to understand that slavery doesn't exist anymore. So, now we're actually trying to re-educate an entire population on the problems. And then we have to educate the investigators on how to go about it and how to attack it. It's all doable. We just need to get concerted efforts to actually go for it.
Brad?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as Jane said, thank you for having us, and thank you for having two Arcturos partners.
By the way, do I need to apply to Arcturos? I'm just curious. All right, so am I to be able to be on these things?
We would love to have you. I'm not a prosecutor. I wasn't in law enforcement, so I come at this from the sanctions angle, and so let me just try to complement a few things that have been said, and maybe, it's a slightly, I would say more positive picture in terms of action taken. The question on the sanction side is always like, to what end? But if you think about, sanctions just in the last 5 years, and if we think, typically when we talk about sanctions, we mean the Treasury Department or the State Department is putting somebody on the specially designated nationals list and freezing their assets and making it impossible to deal with them. But if we think more broadly, to the entity list that the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has, it requires someone to get a license if they're sending an export. If we think about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the list that's maintained by Customs that triggers automatic inspection of imports, we think about visa bans and advisories. Forced labor and human trafficking has actually been the subject of quite a lot of sanctions and sort of sanctions adjacent action over the last 5 years, whether it is related to, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, or, IUU fishing. There was a really massive and important action taken in 2022 against 100 some entities and individuals connected to IUU fishing in China. Similarly, in 2024, IUU fishing action related to Mexico and drug cartels. There's been, Uzbekistan. There was, at the end of the Biden administration, an investigation that went on for a long time related to Cambodia and online scams that connect to North Korea. So it's actually been quite compared to other kind of cross-cutting areas of kind of illicit and criminal activity, a focus. I think in terms of taking action against perpetrators, I think the bigger point that you're making, Duncan, and it gets to the points that Jane and Dave have made of why hasn't that then translated into A, why is it still such a huge problem, and B, where's the enforcement against U.S. entities? And on the first part, I would say, again, this sanctions, I think, are being used, and this has been across administrations. I don't know that it's been as much of a focus in the current Trump administration, but if we go back to Trump 1 and then Biden, pretty cross-cutting. Sanctions, it's always important to think of. I mean, I've written recently, and a couple of things are, they're akin to the punch in the face, right? They're often described in the sort of literature as behavior change tool, and I think that's the wrong approach. They are behavior disruption. They are meant to sort of get somebody's attention, to make things harder for that company or that entity, and then provide broader leverage to solve a broader problem. And I think that's where the challenges have come in terms of, A, what are the policy solutions? What are the diplomatic and policy solutions that we need to engage in across governments, across the world, to really get at this problem? And then 2, the kind of activity that, or disruption that changes behavior is, as you all have said, is criminal or monetary enforcement. And so that's where we've seen a lack of, OFAC enforcement or other agencies, the Commerce Department, Customs, et cetera, really hitting U.S. companies hard with penalties for contravening these sanctions or these actions that have been taken. And I think that gets to a couple of things. One, it gets to, I mean, as both Jane and Dave have pointed out, just the resources that, OFAC as an agency, it's by far the biggest agency dealing with sanctions in the world, and compared to like what it's dealing with, has a scintilla of the staff that it needs, and the enforcement side is even less, right? It's a handful of people. They're not in the field. Typically, they're dealing with information that they get from banks or that's reported to them. And so their ability to proactively go out and find where are the Fortune 500 companies, where are the banks that are continuing to facilitate transactions with companies involved, it's just hard for them for all the reasons that have been said in terms of all the other priorities, because they're getting hit every day with, why aren't there more enforcement cases against companies contravening Russia sanctions or Iran sanctions, et cetera, like where the priorities are. So that's a huge one, is just understanding like where are the enforcement resources, and to Dave and Jane's point, both like how are we educating the enforcement side to know what to look for, to how to bring those cases. And then secondly, I think this is where pressure directly on companies around due diligence comes in. I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but there is a sort of flip side of this, which is, when sanctions actions are taken, Often it just ends up in okay, let's just add a few more companies into our filter and that'll be that, without a real approach to what is the due diligence strategy, what's the risk assessment, what's the typology we need to deal with. And, that's where we're missing agencies holding companies accountable for that part of it. In addition to the gotcha, you were still sending money to that, Mexican entity or that Chinese entity. It's where's your overall compliance program and how does it stack up on this issue? And I think that's an issue that, a priority that we're still not far enough along on a whole range of issues, including forced labor and human trafficking. So I've worked a lot. I'll just end by saying, I've worked a lot in the jewelry sector and the mining sector, in and out of government, and two sectors where human trafficking and forced labor are issues. And in the prioritization, as you talk to companies, and the prioritization of the thinking that companies are doing about where their risks of enforcement come in, it ends up not being high compared to other kinds of issues. And I think that's the challenge. Is it doesn't have to be necessarily on the civil side that you're hitting everybody with a penalty case. It's how do you continue to frankly scare companies to say that this might actually come down your way and we're going to look at you harder, because that also has an impact. And that's where advisories and statements and speeches and these other pieces could come into play while we try to build up on the enforcement side.
Jane, I want to
will
ask.
say,
Sorry, Dave, go
if
ahead.
you don't mind, the statutes, at least in the U.S., and I've been in a lot of countries abroad, the statutes are actually relatively strong. In the U.S., we have a lot of we have extraterritorial jurisdiction. In fact, we have a couple of statutes that allow us to engage in prosecutions for extraterritorial trafficking. What we don't have, though, is an uncomplicated system of how to actually conduct investigations in an extraterritorial fashion. So, while I have lawful authority in the United States, I just remember I was in Afghanistan for 4 months, and I was there for contract labor corruption, and a lot of labor trafficking cases came my way. And here's another side point, was that my officers are like, why are you working labor trafficking cases? You're there for contract corruption. I'm like, well, have you read the contracts? Every contract has a combating trafficking in persons language in there. So if they're violating trafficking statutes, they're violating their contract, and we can go after them that way. So there are multiple ways to skin a cat, right? But while I had extraterritorial jurisdiction, what I did not have is authority to conduct an investigation in a foreign country. My FBI badge and creds didn't mean anything in India or Nepal. And the mutual legal assistance treaty process, or the letters ROG process, which is more I guess informal, are cumbersome at best. And some countries have really good mutual legal assistance treaties with the U.S. and some don't. And it is quite the burdensome process. So that, again, it's not an excuse to do nothing, but it helps us shape an understanding of why it's really challenging to do these cases as well. Sorry, Duncan, you were asking Jane a question about that too.
I was actually going to just say that when I think I can say this is that one of the things that interested me when I was speaking to Jane last year, and we were just talking about a little bit about Goodyear. One of the things that she said to me was that one of the things that it was interesting to her was that it was the first time she'd received here are a bunch of binders of leads from the NGO, and I think that struck me as, oh, hold on, aren't people even just packaging this up as NGOs and from the ground and bringing it to people? And that surprised me when you said that, Jane.
Yeah, and I think one that's really important, Duncan, because where the data is coming from, to Dave's point, is really important. I think kind of pushing back a little bit on, there have been enforcement from, Customs and Border Protection. Companies are put on lists if they're in violation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. But from a practical perspective, there is very little communication and data shared between U.S. agencies. So if I was a prosecutor and I wanted to investigate a company, and I saw a press release from a different agency around a civil or administrative enforcement, the communication and the data sharing there also really requires a lot of work. And we can take baby steps to say, we've added someone to the list. This company can then remediate. That company usually hires really good law firms to then remediate the process. In some ways, sometimes that can be very difficult from a criminal law enforcement perspective to then identify victims who may be willing to speak and come forward. And so following the money and trying to trace, Dave, to your point, when you're overseas, assets and identify financial institutions or other ways where you have shareholder meetings or you have shareholder reports or you have filings with the SEC. We have to use every tool available to understand what is the business model? How are they generating their revenue? If they're generating revenue that is above the source of revenue for other companies, this comes up a lot in the cocoa industry. One cocoa company sourcing, then people push back, and I think there's a question about stable coins or crypto, but the use of blockchain, right, to actually trace supply chain, to proactively use emergent technology to better improve, and then say to a company, you can trace who your suppliers are. You actually can see where that cotton is being sourced, and then hold them accountable in that way. We have to be creative. We cannot rely on the idea that a victim is just going to walk in the door and say, hi, I'm a victim of forced labor. And Dave, I think your point is very true also, that part of the education, I was just talking about this with someone a few days ago, is also the judges in the US who may see a forced labor case and say, hey, I think this is an employment dispute. Or prosecutors who are concerned that it's going to be viewed by a jury if it goes to trial as an employment dispute. And it's really important, and that's where the financial records, the shareholder, the board reports, the board governance, where, that's where it goes to show that this is beyond just, hey, we didn't pay overtime. There is a real discrepancy between the power and the coercion that you have to prove in a forced labor case versus really a company profiting from the exploitation of people to make, profits for their business. And I think we have to make that case much more effective by drawing on the real distinctions, that this isn't just a dispute over somebody's, how much they make.
Right. Yeah. And I labor is hard to, first of all, it's hard to find, because what does it look like? It looks like somebody doing any job that anybody would do. So how do we even get leads into the type of, but it's also hard to prove. There's not a matrix that says, hey, 3 labor violations and anything 4 and above make it labor trafficking. That's not true. So to your point, Jane, I mean, I do understand a little bit of reluctance on the part of prosecutors to really say, hey, is this a labor trafficking case? Because it may very well be just a business practice problem and not actually labor trafficking. So the burden of proof, it's not any higher than it is for another case. We have to know the statutes well. And I think that's one thing that investigators and prosecutors have to be able to do, is they have to be able to dive in to what are the actual elements of the statutes that they have to prove, and then how do they go about conducting the investigations to be able to get the proofs of those things to move it forward. And then, man, I'm a huge fan of asset forfeiture. So I'm not greedy in my personal life, but when it comes to investigations, let's take it all. Because if I take everything you have, you can't harm me on a global scale. You can have bad ideas, and that's the whole point about, is this a human rights problem or is this an economics crime problem? It can be both. But I can't change somebody's mind. I can't change their hearts on a human rights thing. But what I can do is I can take away their ability to actually act on those bad things. And so I'm for using all those tools. And to the question that we had about crypto, it is not an area of expertise for me. So I would love for Jane and Brad to be able to speak to that a little bit more, because it is not an area of expertise for me.
Brad, I just want to ask, well, Dave as well, is that both of you have worked in NGOs, and Brad, you working on the Sentry focused a lot on Central Africa. The issue of exactly is that victims of these things aren't going to just walk in the door. So a lot of it starts with NGOs speaking to people on the ground. But you in the Sentry did an amazing job, and you built this platform that was gathering information and producing reports and providing leads. But how difficult is that to do and sustain? And why isn't it being done more? Because we aren't getting those leads, and we're not from the NGO community putting that hat on, is those leads aren't being generated in the way that is really needed.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I appreciate the kind words about the Sentry, and as I often say, we stole a lot of our ideas from Liberty Shared and Liberty Asia, which you built. So in terms of developing the approach, I mean, you outlined some of them. It takes a long time, and you have to, have enough people, investigators who are on the ground, but who also understand what they're looking at, right? So, I mean, to Dave's point about law enforcement, guys being afraid of financial or trafficking investigations, a lot of folks in the NGO world are, they're human rights that was something we ran into. We had people who were skilled at sort of engaging people on sort of documenting, an atrocity that happened in the region we were working in, right? That was very common. We had people who could do that and do it well. And those skills in terms of gaining trust and gaining the ability to sort of deal and understand community dynamics, when you're in complicated, every geography is complicated. We understand where we live more, but if you're an investigator and you're showing up in the DRC and you're asking somebody about trafficking or forced labor, the understanding the dynamics of the armed groups, the ethnicities, the government, the role of government, and why somebody might be giving you a particular answer, it takes a lot of depth and a lot of experience, and then to have something that's going to turn into something that you can document, that you could take to a government and say, here are the folks you should sanction, or a bank or a company to go. I mean, what we did at the Sentry a lot of was, in addition to taking information, to banks, to Jane at the Justice Department, to Treasury, we would try to go to companies directly, not to report on them and say, issue a press release and say, Fortune 500 company has forced labor, but rather to say, it's very likely you don't know this is happening in your supply chain. You're not doing that level of due diligence. We're essentially providing you free due diligence at this stage to do something about being able to have the information and the expertise that can get you in the door to do that is hard, right? I mean, we at the center, in some ways, often we were able to do it with banks because I had worked with some of those folks at the Treasury Department. So they were, willing to have me come in, but and then you had to have the information there. And so then you're getting into the challenges in the civil society sector in the best of times are, where are the resources coming from? Are you getting support from funders that are not based on a particular project or a 1-year cycle? Again, you're going to need a long time. Are funders interested in the regions you're working on? We really struggled at the Sentry to find funders who were willing to, who cared anymore about South Sudan or the DRC or the Central African Republic. And again, would understand and who were willing to then also say, please look at that issue, right? Because sometimes the funder says, I just want you to look at that other thing. I'm worried about corruption. And to Dave's earlier point, well, if you're thinking about corruption, then you have to look at trafficking and labor because they're all tied together. Or I'm really interested in illicit mining or wildlife trafficking.
Right.
And I don't want you to go down the road of talking about forced labor and human trafficking. That's what this other funder does, or we have another pocket of money for that. So there's it's so many things have to line up in order to have the personnel, the funding, the time, the commitment for a civil society organization. And then frankly, to be able to have the network and the connections to the recipients who are willing to sit down. I mean, when I was back at the State Department, spent a lot of time trying to organize, just briefings and dialogues with civil society, because people aren't sure about dealing with civil society. When I worked working in the private sector, when I was at the Responsible Jewelry Council, most companies in the jewelry sector, when they hear civil society or NGO, they think these guys are going to issue a press release about me, or they're going to come get, they're not here to, we're not trying to tackle the same problem. They're the opposition, right? And so that also becomes a real challenge, I think, for NGOs to develop that. And frankly, there are some NGOs that do that engage in that kind of activity, and there's a good reason for it. But it does, again, you have to get into like, what are we trying to achieve here? Where are we trying to get? And not every NGO sees things the same way, and that also creates challenges. So anyway, I could talk for another hour about this, but let me stop.
Yeah, if I can just add a little bit too, I mean, I echo everything you said, Brad. Funding is an issue. This is our area of expertise, and that's not, the labor trafficking is not necessarily our area of expertise. I also found in the NGO world, frankly, when I was in the government and then when I was in NGOs, there's this inherent distrust between government, particularly law enforcement government, and the civil society organizations that are so vital to being able to get these cases moving and to provide support when the cases have actually come to fruition. So, in fact, I literally just did a webinar for an organization that I represent on relationships between NGOs and law enforcement and how to actually bridge those gaps. And that is vital. And you have to account for potential for corruption. If we're waiting for no corruption to exist, we might as well just pack up and go home now. I mean, we still have to figure out methods to do things because corruption is a reality. But there are ways that we can do things. And I mean, even in the United States, I was with an organization that was doing anti-trafficking investigations because we recognize that most victims don't want to talk to law enforcement first. So we hired experienced investigators as private investigators to then build cases. Just Jane, Duncan, you were saying Jane actually had provided to you guys, or Jane, you were saying it was the first time that it happened in your career, to provide just, buckets of information to law enforcement to give them to go actually, because they're the ones with the real authority, right? They're the ones to go conduct investigations. And the amount of hesitation and downright hostility we got from a lot of law enforcement and prosecutors about that was like, why would we trust this information? Why would we why would we take this information? And I had literally just retired from running the FBI's human trafficking program. And they were still like, dude, who are you? You're not law enforcement anymore. And I'm like, but you take information from people off the street all the time. I'm giving you a package of material in a way that you can present to a grand jury already, so it's just strange, this disconnect between the NGO world and particularly law enforcement. And again, with some of the clients that we had in labor trafficking, because as a civil society organization, we were working with other organizations that were dealing with migrant workers, that were dealing with people who weren't necessarily in the country lawfully, but they had all kinds of information about labor trafficking. And trying to convince them to come forward and actually present their cases to law enforcement was a huge risk, because it put them at risk of being exposed, in the country unlawfully, even though that was the means of exploitation that their trafficker used against them, so challenges.
I think, Dave, part of it is we on the four of us can appreciate really good, thoughtful work that's done by certain nonprofits and certain service providers. And I think part of my very early comments around education and dialogue is really important within the community, because there are also more, I would say, aggressive folks who go out and do proactive investigations themselves. And you often say, you're not law enforcement, you're not vigilantes, you're not here to save people from the streets or in their home countries. And so I'm not defending that piece from the law enforcement side, but as a former prosecutor, we were very thoughtful about who we engaged in. And I think one of the things, and again, to be perfectly candid, Duncan, it's not even that Liberty Shared came in with real reports and thoughts. It was really the type of data that was being brought, the type of data that law enforcement and prosecutors can then parallel reconstruct. Very similarly, that in order to bring those cases. And so part of it is building trust within the communities and building trust, to Brad's point, with the industry. But if I, may say something more spicy, it's really nice to go in and talk to a company once or twice and say, hey, you may have a problem. But then how do we hold them accountable? When it comes to cocoa, it's been years that this agreement, right, that was formed by the different chocolate companies to eradicate forced labor and child forced labor from their supply chains. I mean, every few years we get this extension. And at some point, the question becomes, what are either the civil remedies, because in the US we have very strong now statutory authority on behalf of victims to bring civil claims against companies who are facilitating or knowingly profiting off of the exploitation, or criminal, where we do need to put on our more white collar corporate investigations hats that we know are done by investigating financial institutions if they're in violation of their obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act, or some other corporate authority, whether, again, as we said, about corruption, because the rubber really needs to hit the road once those other administrative processes or those reputational or those articles, right, in the Times or other newspapers aren't enough. And sometimes it is, right? And like, if we look at what the FCC just did with response to Pornhub, right, we are seeing other regulatory agencies taking action against companies for different types of violations. I think for me, we have to think about forced labor as more of an organized crime, money laundering, corruption, national security issue. There was a question again about scam centers or cyber scam centers in Southeast Asia. Those are jurisdictions that we all, and I'm sure many who are watching this webinar, have been talking about from a traditional forced labor perspective, right? Just talking about Goodyear, it's Malaysia. It's those same countries. Now they're diversifying. They're engaging in sextortion, which is the IGM report that just came out from those scam centers. We have individuals who are actually victims of forced labor who are being recruited to those centers, who are then engaged in forced criminality. And then you have a second victim who is losing their funds, whether it's elder fraud or a romance scam. So the criminal networks are much more complex, and we can't look at it with like, I need to prove a forced labor case. If you can prove a money laundering wire fraud case against those criminal networks, we should be saying that's a success. If we are able to trace the funds and, to Dave's point, then recover them for forfeiture, I'm all about it, but we have to be much more creative. And I think we have to train law enforcement to also feel like they have enough resources, not to feel like, oh, but I'm just a human trafficking prosecutor, or I'm just a, money laundering prosecutor.
Right. And that is exactly the case. And the pushback I had when I was in the government, and then that I heard from people, was like, how come we're not charging trafficking? How come we're not charging trafficking violations? Hey, if I can dismantle an organization through a money laundering charge, I've dismantled that organization. Let's go get them the way we can get them. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a trafficking charge, which then goes to defining success, which then goes to the complicated issue of what resources get applied to what type of issue. And that and those are policy issues and matters that are well above my pay grade.
I mean, just to say, I mean, just on that last point, and this would probably be a different hour of a webinar, but I mean, I do think, I mean, back to your original question, Duncan, to me, and then I think we are living in a very, in a clearly shifting political moment around both prioritization for law enforcement and sanctions, and, you know, the relationship in the US anyway, the relationship between civil society and government, and the willingness of civil society to engage government. So not to take not to sort of reference a political position anyway,
Right.
We would be missing a moment. We would be missing a point if we didn't say, like, things are shifting in a meaningful way within these agencies and between federal law enforcement. We haven't really talked about states and sort of other, I mean, we talked a bit about other jurisdictions, but you know, things are evolving in a way that is going to have an impact on this kind of work and these kinds of cases, and also the willingness or even the perception of engaging, you know, with the federal government in these kinds of investigations. I mean, I think a lot of civil society organizations are asking that question now. Can we be public about it? You know, when we were at the Century, we would publish a report and say, and today we delivered a bunch of dossiers and we expect action to be taken. You know, I think over time, you know, we'll see how these things evolve, but I think, you know, it's going to be important to watch the willingness and the impact of things like that on these kinds of cases. And same for companies. The impact is also the same on the private sector.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes. I just wanted to ask you all one last question, which is, what we've described is really there's a lot to do that has not in a way been done. It's not like we've done these and it hasn't worked. There's a lot of communication to be done. There's a lot of training to be done. Are we? I mean, are we really sort of, okay, we need to set out and actually start this, and this is going to be a long-term process of years, or is and therefore there's reason to be, I mean, to Brad's point, regardless of what happens in the next 4 or 5 years, you're training a new generation of law enforcement people, you're training a new generation of NGO people from the ground, really to understand white-collar crime, forced labor as it pertains to the economic aspect of it, financial crime. And so in a way, it's okay, we need to just get down, knuckle down, and do this work for the next 10, 15 years to really train people and build a generation of actual prosecutors, investigators, and agents and NGOs. Is that actually where we're at? We've really just need to start.
I mean, I can kick off. Yeah, I can kick off because I would like to take a more positive view and level set. I think we are making progress. And I say this because when I first started working in the anti-trafficking space many years ago, we were working on trying to help train law enforcement and prosecutors on survivor-centered and victim-centered communication and building those relationships and using victim coordinators. When I first started as a prosecutor, there were 4 victim witness coordinators for the entire country. We have come a long way. If someone had told me back then in 2011 and 2012 that there would be civil cases brought by victims of sex trafficking against very large international financial institutions, I would not have believed them. If I was told at that time that there would be, Duncan, a Goodyear investigation, that companies were going to be put on multi-government agency lists from the State Department to Commerce to Treasury, which was being done under the end of the first Trump administration when the Uyghur Forced Labor Act was starting to just, you know, come to be, I think we have come actually a long way. Do I think we have a long way to go? Yes. But I think if we look historically at where we came from and where the TVPA was in 2000 to where we are with the, the authorities that are available in the US now in 2025, we've come a long way. We have a lot more work to do, and we do need to train. We need resources. We need better education. We need to rely on global Magnitsky for OFAC sanctions. We need enforcement on the criminal side. But I do believe that there are all of these people who genuinely are trying to figure out how to push these efforts forward. So I want to believe that we're just sort of in the middle of the fight. And there's more to be done, of course. But I think if we look back in the anti-trafficking space, we've come a long way also.
Jane, I'm so glad you said that. Like, I feel like I'm pushing a rock up a hill when I say that, because I get people who are in the anti-trafficking community who are very passionate, who are very concerned about the quote unquote lack of progress. And I'm like, hey, can we do a little bit of a historic perspective here? I mean, frankly, for the first time in the history of humankind, slavery is illegal everywhere in the world. That doesn't mean people are acting on it everywhere in the world. I get that. But it's the first time in human history that that's true. And it's been true within the last 25 years. So we are relatively new into this. And I think, to Jane, to your point, we have made incredible strides in those 25 years. Let's not pretend there's not more to do. And you said it really well. I mean, and my concern is that when I was actually working in the government on the anti-trafficking team, I would have really good teams in Houston, and then those agents would transfer to somewhere else, and I would have nobody in Houston. Or, I'm just using that as an example, right? You know what I mean? So we need succession planning. So we need more and more people who are actually can do both the financial crimes investigations and understand human trafficking, and so they can work them together. We need to continue to develop that, and we need to continue to do more. But I think we have actually made pretty significant progress on a lot of things in a relatively short period of time. It's an issue that's going to outlive us, which means we need people who are going to continue to speak and continue to advocate and continue to go forward. And let's not, that is not permission to stop doing any work. It's not giving ourselves permission to relax and say, hey, high five, we did a great job. All right, let's move on, because traffickers are sentient people who actually figure ways to and particularly larger businesses, they're figuring out other ways to actually get it. The perfect example is these scam centers now, right? That is a new model that we now have to adjust to. And we are constantly, and I say we, I'm talking about the enforcement world, we have to continue to adjust, and we have to continue to adapt to those things. And we have really, really bright people who really, really also passionate people who are looking at these things. And I trust that they will continue on the fight.
Thank you, Dave. Brad, final word to you. Supply chains adapt, and you've been looking at that through the mineral world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I would certainly echo. I mean, I've been less directly in the fight than Jane and Dave, but certainly would have the same perspective. And I think in terms of the supply chains adapt, I mean, I think I would make 2 points in terms of how to build on where we are. One is just continuing to reinforce the sort of cross-cutting issues, right? When you talk to a company, bigger companies that are dealing with a pretty wide array of issues in their sort of responsible sourcing, business and human rights, sustainability, wherever this sort of fits. And obviously there's also just straight criminality, anti-corruption, et cetera. But finding ways to, and in worlds in which, again, civil society resources or law enforcement resources are going to continue to be restrained, finding ways not to sort of dilute the importance and the relevance of human trafficking and forced labor, but to make the connection so that when a company thinks, well, I need to work on climate risk. Okay, well, how is that connecting to your suppliers, your supply chain, and the way that climate change is impacting migration, which is feeding into, et cetera, like those kinds of things, or it's, a number of companies in the supply chains I work in are thinking about illicit, they're thinking about the stuff, the illicit minerals, the illicit timber, and not thinking about, well, who are the people that are involved in that? Who are the people involved in that? Whether it's just at the source or in the processing side, in, you know, whether it's in South Asia or China or South America or in the US, right? And sort of thinking through that and bringing it into a more, integrating it into a more holistic, integrated approach that when these higher profile cases happen, it isn't sort of leading to the response of like, well, that's that problem over there, or that's another company's problem. It's like, where does this fit in mind? Yeah. And then secondly, I think it's a matter of, for the companies that are in the sectors where this has been a focus, whether it's cocoa or certain forms of agriculture, mining, et cetera, the enforcement is critical. But for me, it's a matter also of how can the sort of softer pieces lay the groundwork, whether it's more advisories, more, you know, having senior officials at one of the agencies convene a roundtable, invite, you know, if you want to get the attention of the Fortune 500, invite them to a roundtable that you do a press release on and say, we invited the CEOs of the top 20 Fortune 500 companies to talk about human trafficking. Doesn't cost anything other than, you know, the time that it takes of people. Make it that kind of prioritization that then triggers the internal, like, what are we going to say? What do we have to show? How do we do this? All fits together. And I think we can do, those are the things that while we're training more law enforcement, while we're gathering evidence, keeping up that pressure, and again, connecting that kind of softer pressure to these other areas can be really effective.
Thanks very much, Brad. Thank you, Jane and Dave, for joining me. And we will post the video shortly as well, and I'll let you know. But thank you very much for joining me, and I'll catch up with you all individually at another time anyway.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.